Imagine this. A 5-year-old boy stands on a high balcony, his small hand gripping the cold stone. Below him, the world is screaming. The air is thick with the metallic scent of blood and the acrid smoke of a kingdom in its death throes. Behind him, his nurse is panting, her eyes wide with a terror that smells like damp earth. "They're coming," she whispers, and the sound of iron boots splintering the palace gates confirms it. In her desperate rush to save the last of the royal line, she scoops him up. She runs. Her foot catches on a loose tile. Time slows. The boy feels the sudden, sickening absence of gravity. A bone-shattering crack echoes against the marble floor, followed by a scream that will haunt the palace halls for generations. When the dust of the coup settles, the boy is alive, but his world is shattered. Both of his feet are crushed, twisted into useless shapes that will never walk again. In one afternoon, he has lost his grandfather, the king, his father, the prince, and the very use of his own body. He is a prince of nothing, a cripple in hiding, waiting for the new king to find him and finish the job. But why does the new king want him dead? In the ancient world, mercy was a weakness and a bloodline was a target. If you were the grandson of the fallen King Saul, you weren't a person. You were a loose end that needed to be severed. How does a boy go from the heights of a palace to the literal land of nothing? And what happens when the man who took your family's throne finally calls your name? The boy's name was Mephibosheth. The name itself carries a heavy weight, often translated as "from the mouth of shame." His life began in the golden light of the tribe of Benjamin, the grandson of Saul, the first king of Israel, and the son of Jonathan, the greatest warrior the nation had ever seen. He was royalty. He was destined for command. But the wheels of providence turn in ways that defy human logic. On the dark slopes of Mount Gilboa, the glory of Israel was extinguished. King Saul fell on his own sword, and Jonathan, the noble prince, was cut down by Philistine blades. When the news reached the capital, the palace didn't mourn, it panicked. In those days, when a dynasty fell, the incoming king would traditionally slaughter every male relative of the previous ruler to ensure no rebellion could ever rise. Mephibosheth was only 5. He was the legal heir. He was a dead man walking. As his nurse fled with him into the jagged wilderness, the fall that broke his legs also broke his future. He was spirited away across the Jordan River to a place called Lo-Debar. In Hebrew, Lo-Debar literally means no word or no pasture. It was a wasteland, a place for the forgotten, the outcasts, and those who wished to remain invisible. For 20 years, the Prince of Israel lived in the dirt of Lo-Debar, hiding in the house of a man named Machir. Every time he heard a horse's hoofbeat in the distance, did he tremble. Every time a stranger entered the village, did he wonder if the executioner had finally arrived. He grew into a man who viewed himself as a mistake, a ghost inhabiting a broken frame. Think about the psychological toll of 2 decades in exile. How do you look at your twisted limbs every morning and not see them as a physical manifestation of God's rejection? Every step he couldn't take was a reminder of the kingdom he didn't have. He wasn't just hiding from a king, he was hiding from his own identity. Meanwhile, in Jerusalem, the shepherd King David sat upon the throne. David, the man who had replaced Mephibosheth's grandfather. David, the warrior who had been chased like an animal by Saul. The world expected David to be hunting for the remnants of Saul's house. They expected blood. But David was a man haunted by a different kind of memory, a covenant made in secret years ago with a man he loved more than a brother. He remembered Jonathan. He remembered the promise, Show me the kindness of the Lord. Does your past define your future, or does a promise hold more power than a pedigree? One afternoon, the atmosphere in the royal court changed. David summoned Ziba, an old servant of Saul's house. The air must have been thick with tension. Ziba was a man of status, having 15 sons and 20 servants of his own. But he knew where the bodies were buried. David looked at him from the throne, not with the cold eyes of a tyrant, but with a strange, searching hunger. "Is there anyone remaining of the house of Saul?" David asked, "to whom I may show the kindness of God?" Notice the wording. He didn't ask if there was anyone worthy. He didn't ask if there was a threat. He asked for someone to receive kindness. Ziba's response was cautious, perhaps even a bit dismissive. "There is still a son of Jonathan," Ziba replied. "He is lame in both feet." In Ziba's eyes, the man's disability was his defining characteristic. He was telling the king, "There is someone, but he's broken. He's useless to you. He's no threat." David didn't care about the brokenness. He asked one question: "Where is he?" When Ziba revealed the location, Lo-Debar, the king immediately sent his chariots. Imagine the scene in that dusty, forgotten village when the royal guard of Israel pulled up to the house of Machir. The villagers would have scattered. The soldiers, clad in bronze and leather, demanded the grandson of Saul. Mephibosheth must have known. This was the moment he had rehearsed in his nightmares for 20 years. The king had found the loose end. They carried him. They had to. He couldn't run. He couldn't fight. He was placed in a chariot and driven toward the city of David, toward the very palace where he should have grown up as a prince, but where he now entered as a prisoner of fate. As the gates of Jerusalem swung open, Mephibosheth looked at the grandeur he had lost. The sensory overload must have been agonizing. The smell of incense, the sight of the cedar pillars, the sound of a thriving kingdom. He was brought into the presence of David. He fell on his face, his useless legs dragging behind him, his forehead touching the cold floor. He waited for the sword. "Mephibosheth," David said. The sound of his name, spoken by the king, must have felt like a lightning strike. "At your service," he whispered, his voice cracking with the weight of impending death. Before the king delivers the final word, before the fate of the house of Saul is sealed, we have to ask ourselves, how often do we hide in our own Lo-Debar, convinced that if the king saw our brokenness, he would surely destroy us? If this story is gripping you, take a second to hit that like button and subscribe. We're diving deep into the darkest corners of the Bible to find the light, and you don't want to miss what's coming next. David looked down at the trembling man. "Don't be afraid," David said, "for I will surely show you kindness for the sake of your father Jonathan. I will restore to you all the land that belonged to your grandfather Saul, and you will always eat at my table." The silence in the room must have been deafening. This wasn't just a pardon, it was a restoration. It was an adoption. David was giving back the massive royal estates, the thousands of acres of Benjaminite land, and then he went further. He gave Mephibosheth a seat at the royal table, the same table where the king's sons sat. Mephibosheth's response is one of the most hauntingly humble lines in all of Scripture. He bowed down again and said, "What is your servant that you should notice a dead dog like me?" A dead dog. In the ancient Near East, a dog was an unclean scavenger. A dead dog was the lowest thing imaginable. Mephibosheth didn't see a prince in the mirror. He saw roadkill. He saw a mistake. But David wasn't looking at Mephibosheth's feet. He was looking at Jonathan's face. He saw the covenant. The king then turned to Ziba and commanded him to work the land for Mephibosheth, to bring in the crops, so that the grandson of Saul would have everything he needed. Ziba with all his sons and servants, became the steward for a man he had just described as lame in both feet. The power dynamic had flipped in an instant. The outcast was now the master. So Mephibosheth lived in Jerusalem, and he ate at the king's table, just like one of the king's sons. The Bible adds a poignant, repetitive detail. And he was lame in both feet. Why mention it again? Because it paints a cinematic picture. Imagine the royal banquets, the finest meats, the best wines, the most powerful men in the world sitting together. You see Joab, the fierce general. You see Absalom, the stunningly beautiful prince. And then there is Mephibosheth. When he sat at the tablecloth covered his feet. From the waist up, he looked like royalty. From the waist down, he was a reminder of a broken world. He belonged at the table not because he was fast or strong or useful, but because he was loved by the king. But stories of restoration are rarely simple. Shadows were gathering over Jerusalem. Years later, David's own son, Absalom, staged a bloody coup. The king had to flee his own city, once again becoming a fugitive in the wilderness. As David escaped, Ziba met him with a donkey load of food and supplies. David asked, "Where is Mephibosheth?" Ziba, seeing an opportunity to seize the land for himself, lied. He told David that Mephibosheth had stayed in Jerusalem, saying, "Today the house of Israel will give me back my grandfather's kingdom." David, heartbroken and feeling betrayed by everyone, snapped. He told Ziba, "Everything that belonged to Mephibosheth is now yours." Can you imagine the sting? Mephibosheth, who had been pulled from the dirt by David, was now being accused of the ultimate treachery. For months, as the civil war raged, Mephibosheth stayed in the occupied city. The Bible tells us he did not trim his beard, wash his clothes, or care for his feet from the day the king left until the day he returned. He was in deep physical mourning. He wasn't plotting, he was grieving for the man who had shown him mercy. When David finally returned to Jerusalem after the death of Absalom, Mephibosheth came to meet him. David, still suspicious, confronted him. "Why didn't you go with me, Mephibosheth?" The truth came out. Mephibosheth explained that he had ordered his donkey to be saddled so he could follow David, but Ziba had betrayed him, left him behind, and slandered him. Mephibosheth didn't beg for his land back. He didn't scream for justice. He simply said, "My lord the king is like an angel of God. Do what is good in your eyes. All my father's descendants deserved nothing but death from my lord the king, but you gave your servant a place among those who eat at your table. What right have I to make any more complaints to the king?" David, perhaps embarrassed by his own rush to judgment or simply overwhelmed by the complexity of the situation, tried to split the difference. "I have decided," David said. "You and Ziba shall divide the land." Mephibosheth's answer is the ultimate proof of his heart. He didn't care about the property. He didn't care about the wealth. He looked at David and said, "Let him take it all. Now that my lord the king has returned home in safety." He didn't want the land, he wanted the king. Do you see the parallel? We are all Mephibosheth. We are born into a fallen line, hiding in our own versions of Lo-Debar, the land of nothing. We are broken by a fall we didn't ask for, hiding from a king we've been told to fear. We are convinced that our lameness, our sins, and our inadequacies make us dead dogs. But the king is searching. He isn't looking for the strong, he's looking for the descendants of the promise. He sends his chariots into the wasteland to find the broken and bring them to the palace. And when we get there, we find that the table is already set. At that table, our brokenness is covered by his grace. We are not guests, we are sons. Mephibosheth's story ends not with a grand military victory, but with a quiet, persistent presence at the table. He remained a reminder to David and to us that kindness is more powerful than vengeance, and that grace doesn't require us to be whole. It only requires us to show up. In the end, Mephibosheth had a son named Micah, and through him the line of Jonathan continued. The line that was supposed to be extinguished survived because of a covenant of mercy. Even in the darkest chapters of Israel's history, even when the kingdom split and the wars returned, the story of the lame prince who found a home remained a whisper of hope. It was a foreshadowing of a greater king who would come centuries later, a king who would not just dine with the broken, but would be broken himself, so that the outcasts of the world could finally go home. What part of your life do you think is too lame for the king's table? Are you still hiding in Lo-Debar, afraid that the invitation is a trap? The chariots are outside. The king has called your name. The only question left is, will you let him carry you to the table? Remember to like, share, comment, and subscribe. See you in the next video.